Chapter 10. Tragedy in Sweden. Ogilvy sent for me next morning and showed me a photograph of a man wearing a heavy coat and a fur hat. There was a lot of snow in the picture. "Have you seen that man before?" he asked. "Yes, that's George Ashton," I replied. "No, it isn't," he said. "That man's name is Fyodor Koslov, and he lives in Stockholm. At least, that's what his passport says." He passed another photograph across the desk. I took one look at it and said, "That's Benson." "Are you quite sure?" "These photographs came from our man in Sweden. We didn't have any good recent photos of Ashton and Benson, so you're the only person who can really identify them." "I'm quite sure. Those are photographs of Ashton and Benson." "What do you want me to do now?" I replied. "I want you to go to Stockholm. First of all, talk to our man there, a man called Henty." "And then? Do I contact Ashton? Tell him about Maybury? Tell him it's safe to come back to England?" "No. It might frighten him if he knows that we are still watching him, even after 30 years. Just watch him and find out what the hell he's doing in Stockholm." Ogilvy didn't know it, but he had just made the worst mistake of his career. It was dark and cold in Stockholm at that time of year, and it never stopped snowing. I felt very cold and wondered why Ashton had decided to come to such a place. Henty, the man who had taken the photographs of Ashton and Benson, was our only man in Stockholm, and it was impossible for him to keep an eye on both of them for 24 hours a day. I had to go to the British Embassy to ask for assistance. The man I saw was called Cutler. He did not like me. "Mr. Jaggard," he said, "we haven't got men free to do casual police work. Why is this man Ashton so important? I've never heard of him." "I'm not allowed to tell you anything more about him. He's too important." He didn't like that, and refused to give me any more men to watch Ashton. So I telephoned Ogilvy in London, and told him about the difficulties that Cutler was making for me. An hour later, Cutler suddenly appeared at my hotel, and arranged for several men to help me. We watched Ashton and Benson very carefully, and they did nothing unusual. Ashton visited museums, went to the theatre and to the cinema, and he spent a lot of time in bookshops. The only strange thing about them was that they did nothing strange. It was as if they were on holiday. I began to wonder if Ashton was having his first ever holiday from the problems of his business life in England. 4 weeks went by like this, a boring time for all of us, and Cutler began to complain that his men were wasting their time. One day, however, Henty came to see me with news that worried me. He had discovered that we were not the only people who were watching Ashton. There was a team of other watchers who also followed Ashton everywhere he went. The next morning, Henty and I followed one of them when his duty period was finished. We were horrified to find that the man went back to the Russian embassy. I rang Ogilvy to tell him what we had discovered. He too was horrified and caught the next plane to Sweden. We sat down to talk about this new situation. "Look," he said, "maybe we're making too much out of all this. For 30 years, Ashton has run his business quietly in England. He hasn't given us any of the wonderful scientific ideas we hoped for. If he wants to leave England, maybe even go back to Russia, why should we stop him? Why not let him do what he wants?" "Why not?" I agreed. "I can't say I understand what's been happening, and I'm beginning to feel that we shouldn't really be involved in this." "On the other hand," continued Ogilvy, There are two things that puzzle me and worry me. Why did he run away? And why did he build that strong room and then not use it? Why was it empty, Malcolm? Why had it never been used? I've spent a lot of time asking myself the same questions. I still don't know the answers, I replied. That's what worries me. Ashton is a very clever man. He's very good at making people look and think in the wrong direction. That's how he was able to leave Russia in the first place. Maybe he's pointing us in the wrong direction. He's trying to make us believe that he has no secrets. That could mean that there is something hidden, something that could be very important. Then why the hell did he build the strong room in the first place? I said, confused. To deceive us, so that whoever found the strong room would think they were wasting their time. He wanted us to think that because the secret room was empty, there was no secret information to hide. But you think there may be something secret? Some scientific discovery? Hidden in another place? Maybe. Even probably. But I don't know for sure, said Ogilvy. In any case, I can't take the risk of leaving George Ashton for the Russians. I don't know why they're following him, but if they ever find out that he's really Chelyuskin, they'll be very interested, and they'll want him back. Like us, they'll want to know what scientific ideas he's been having in the last 30 years. I can't afford that risk. So, we've got to take Ashton back to England, whether he likes it or not. I could go and tell him the Russians are following him, I suggested. He'd come with us willingly then. I don't know, replied Ogilvy. If he thought the British Secret Service was still following him after 30 years, he might get so angry that he'd go back to Russia willingly. No, that's not good enough. It's too risky. But if he finds out that the Russians are watching him, he'll probably go straight back to England, I said. Provided that he doesn't know about us, growled Ogilvy suspiciously. How do you plan to arrange it? Ask the Russians to wear flags in their hats? Wait a minute, I said. I've got an idea. I turned to Larry Godwin, who had come to Stockholm with Ogilvy. How well do you speak Russian, Larry? That depends on what kind of regional accent you want, he replied. Why? Ogilvy began to understand. I see, he said thoughtfully. The Russians are very careful when they watch Ashton, too careful to make mistakes. But we could make a mistake for them, and frighten Ashton away from them. I like the idea. We considered our plan carefully, and 3 days later, we put it into operation. The situation outside Ashton's flat was becoming crazy. 2 men from the British Embassy were looking in shop windows, waiting for Ashton or Benson to come out. They did not know that they were being watched by 2 Russian agents looking in other shop windows, and the 2 Russians were being watched by 2 men from our department. There was hardly any room left for tourists in that narrow street. At 10:30 that morning, Ashton came out and walked towards the centre of the city. Larry Godwin and everybody else followed him. Ashton went into a bookshop, and as he was looking at a book, Larry, who had gone in behind him, dropped a book and swore loudly in Russian. Ashton put his book back on the shelf and left the shop immediately. He walked around the streets for quite a long time, looking behind him frequently, and then went to have lunch in a restaurant. Larry followed him into the restaurant and sat down at a table near Ashton. When Larry ordered his meal, he spoke Swedish with a strong Russian accent. Ashton looked very worried and finished his meal rather quickly. Larry came out of the restaurant close behind Ashton and followed him back to Ashton's flat, making sure that Ashton could see that he was being followed. After Ashton had returned to his flat, we had a long wait in the cold. We all had little radio telephones, and at 10 to 9 in the evening, I received the message we had been waiting for. Ashton and Benson have left the flat. They're carrying bags and walking towards the taxis at the end of the street. Benson took a taxi to the railway station, but Ashton went off in the opposite direction. At the station, Benson bought 2 tickets for Göteborg in the west of Sweden. There was half an hour before the train left, but Ashton did not appear, and when the train went, only Benson was on it, together with several of my men. Ashton had disappeared again. I decided to follow the train by car. If Benson had bought 2 tickets, maybe Ashton intended to join him at the next station. I sent 2 men to the first station where Benson's train would stop, and Larry and I drove to the next station, Eskilstuna. On the way, we heard on the radio phone that Ashton had in fact got on the train at the first stop. I relaxed again. "We've got them now," I told Larry. But when we arrived at the railway station at Eskilstuna, we learnt that Ashton and Benson had jumped from the train when it stopped near a small country village. I looked at the map. The nearest town was called Strängnäs, and we arrived there about an hour later. It was a small town with only 1 hotel. Henty knew it quite well because it was also an army training centre which he had visited officially. He went into the hotel and found that Ashton and Benson were definitely there, probably fast asleep in their rooms. We booked into the hotel too, and I made my plans for the next morning. I wanted Michaelis, Brent and Henty to be early for breakfast. I would be sitting in a car outside the hotel. Brent would have a secret radio microphone and would talk quietly into it so that he could tell me what was happening. Halfway through breakfast, Larry was to go in and make Ashton think that the Russians had succeeded in following him even to Strängnäs. The next morning, I waited in the car. I hated what I was doing. I wanted to go and talk to Ashton, to tell him everything that had happened, and convince him that he had run away from England for the wrong reasons. I wanted to explain to him that the acid attack on Gillian had been a mistake made by a madman, and that it had nothing at all to do with him. I wanted to persuade him that it was completely safe to go back to England and take up his normal family and business life again. But Ogilvy did not want that. He did not want Ashton to know that he was still being watched by the British Secret Service. And I had to do what Ogilvy said, even if I disagreed with him. At the same time, I liked George Ashton. He was Penny's father, and I hated myself for what I had to do. Michaelis, Brent and Henty went to have breakfast in the hotel at 7:30. A quarter of an hour later, Ashton and Benson came into the restaurant and sat down for breakfast. 5 minutes later, Larry Godwin arrived and spoke to the waitress in Swedish with a very strong Russian accent. Ashton noticed him and went very, very pale. As Larry followed the waitress to the table, he greeted Ashton in a friendly manner, but in Russian, and Ashton knocked over his cup. I listened to Brent's description of what was happening, and I felt sick at what we were doing to George Ashton. Ashton and Benson left the restaurant, and a few minutes later they were outside the hotel. Larry followed them and did not try to hide. Ashton did not seem to know what to do, and on the radio I told Larry to ask Ashton to go with him. At first it seemed that Ashton was going to do this, but Benson shook his head and tried to get Ashton away. Finally, they started to walk out of town towards the forest. Over the radio came Larry's voice. "I talked to Ashton, and he was ready to come with me, but Benson spoiled it. He didn't want to listen to what I had to say. What are they doing now? I asked. They've just left the road and walked into the forest. We all followed them into the trees. They kept changing direction to try to get away from us, and twice we nearly lost them. After we'd gone about 3 kilometers into the forest, I heard the sharp sound of guns. From where I was standing, I could not see Ashton, but Henty was further ahead. Over the radio, he said, "It's the Swedish army. This is a training area, and Ashton is walking straight towards the guns. He'll get himself killed." I started running as fast as I could. I had to stop George Ashton, and I did not care what Ogilvy said. I ran on until I thought my chest would burst. I shouted, "Ashton! George Ashton! Stop!" He stopped and turned round, and his eyes grew wide with surprise. I had almost reached him when there was a single shot, and Ashton fell. I heard Henty run past me as I bent over Ashton. There was blood coming from the corner of his mouth. "Malcolm, what?" "Take it easy, George," I said, holding him up in my arms. He pulled his hand from his pocket with a piece of paper. The... Then he fell back, his eyes still open, looking at the sky. George Ashton was dead. I knelt there in the snow, thinking how badly I had done my job. I cursed Ogilvy, and wished I had done what my own mind had told me was right. But it was too late. I had never felt so bad in all my life. Henty came back with a gun in his hand. "I got him," he said. "Got who, for God's sake?" "Benson." I stared at him. "You shot Benson?" He looked at me in surprise. "Well, he shot Ashton, didn't he? I saw him do it. Maybe you couldn't see him, but I did." This was almost too much for me. "Benson shot Ashton?" "Yes, he tried to shoot me too," said Henty. "And if anyone shoots at me, I shoot back." I was still trying to take this in when there was a loud noise at the top of the hill above us, and a huge army vehicle appeared. It stopped in front of us, and a Swedish officer climbed out. Henty threw his gun on the ground as I looked at the piece of paper that Ashton had tried to give me. It was a railway timetable for trains from Stockholm to Göteborg. The Swedish police were not happy. They had 2 dead bodies and 4 live men in the middle of an army training area. They took us to an army centre where we were kept for the next 3 weeks. I had no idea what was happening back in London, but suddenly, early one morning, I was told to get dressed and was taken to Stockholm Airport. The officer who had come with me said, "There is your plane, Mr. Jaggard. You are no longer welcome in Sweden." I arrived at Heathrow Airport in London and was met by Ogilvy. He took me to my flat and told me to report to his office the next morning. As I got out of the car, I asked him about Penny. He told me that she was away in Scotland. "Does she know?" I asked. "Yes," Ogilvy said quietly. He put a piece of paper in my hand and said, "You ought to read this." Then he drove away. The piece of paper contained a short article from a newspaper, which described how 2 Englishmen, George Ashton, 56, and Howard Benson, 64, had died in an unfortunate accident in Sweden. They had walked into an army training area by mistake and been killed in the gunfire. Chapter 11. More Mysteries and New Dangers. In Ogilvy's office the next morning, I had to go over everything that had happened, from my arrival in Stockholm until Ashton's death. Ogilvy wanted to be sure of every detail. The mystery was Benson. Why had he shot Ashton? He had worked for Ashton for more than 20 years. What possible reason could there be for killing him so suddenly? Ogilvy had studied every known fact of Benson's life, and had found nothing wrong, nothing strange, nothing even slightly suspicious. Ogilvy told me I had to attend a meeting with people from other departments the next day. He reminded me that officially I did not know of Ashton's background as Chelyuskin, because that was in level black of the computer, which I was not supposed to have read. The meeting on the next day was difficult. All the people there seemed to be the heads of other departments which had been embarrassed by what had happened in Sweden. The most difficult questions came from Lord Krieger. "Is it correct that Mr. Ogilvy told you not to let Ashton know who you were?" "Yes, that's correct," I replied. "But we have just been told that you showed yourself to him deliberately. It was only when he saw you that he turned back. Is that not so?" "That's correct." "So it was when you disobeyed Mr. Ogilvy's orders that Ashton was killed?" I was very angry, but kept my voice calm. Ashton was going straight into the army training area, which was very dangerous. The most important thing was to stop him. It was a complete shock to me that Benson killed him. "But we can't be sure that Benson killed Ashton," objected Lord Krieger. "The bullets from the body prove that," said Ogilvy. "But Mr. Jaggard has failed throughout this operation. He let Ashton escape in England, and he has now caused a great deal of trouble because of the stupid way he tried to deal with Ashton in Sweden. I said once before that I did not have a very high opinion of Mr. Jaggard, and I think I was right." I felt very miserable, and wondered if Krieger was right. After the committee meeting, Ogilvy invited me to lunch, not because he was sorry for me, and not because he wanted to be friendly. To my great surprise, he wanted to continue to investigate the Ashton case, and that was to be my new job. As far as everyone else was concerned, I had made a terrible mistake, and I had to be punished. But Ogilvy thought that his department had been tricked over Ashton. He wanted to know who had tricked him, and why. And he thought that I was the best man to find this out. I was not at all happy with this plan. It would mean more lying to Penny, and I had done enough damage to our personal lives already. Ashton had been killed, and I felt that I was responsible for that. Ogilvy disagreed. "You didn't kill Ashton. Who did?" "Benson killed him, damn it." Ogilvy raised his voice to a shout. "Then find out why, for God's sake. Don't do it for me, do it for Penny. Find out why Benson, who lived so long in the same house with her father, with her and her sister, find out why Benson killed her father. You owe that to her." "All right," I said. "You've convinced me. I'll do it for her." After I left Ogilvy, I said goodbye to the people I had worked with in the department. They felt sorry for me, because my new job was, as far as they knew, as a messenger. But there were no messages for me to take. In fact, I went off to start the investigation which Ogilvy wanted me to do. I went out to Marlow to find out if Penny was back from Scotland. As I arrived, I bumped into Peter Michaelis, who was just leaving the Ashton house. "What the devil are you doing here?" I asked. "Playing model trains," he replied happily. "Miss Ashton gave me permission to use the set upstairs whenever I like. It really is a fantastic railway. Here, look at this book." He showed me a thick book of railway timetables. "Ashton was trying to run this old timetable, but it doesn't seem quite correct. It's not the same as the original timetable, so I'm going to try to compare his timetable with one that I've got at home." "Which Miss Ashton gave you permission to do this?" I asked.
"Gillian," he replied. "I used to talk to her a lot when she was in hospital. When she found I was interested in the model railway, she said I could come along and play with it. She's a nice girl, and we get on very well."
He paused.
"I don't spend all my time with the railway."
I smiled. "Is Gillian here now?"
"Yes, she is, and she's expecting Penny home for lunch."
Penny was very pleased to see me. Ogilvy had told her that I had been on some secret job in the United States when her father was killed. I was very grateful for this lie. It made it easier for me to avoid telling her too many direct lies. Penny asked me if I knew anything more about her father's death. I told her that I knew little more than she did.
"But why had he gone to Sweden, Malcolm? You were investigating him. Didn't you find out anything at all?"
Not really. At first we thought that he had run away because of the attack on Gillian, but when we found that man Mabry, that idea led nowhere. As far as we know, your father was having a long, quiet holiday in Sweden. There was nothing wrong in that, but we still don't know why he ran away so suddenly. We'll probably never know.
"I suppose you're right, Malcolm. But what he did was so strange. It wasn't like him at all. I'm still very puzzled and worried. I need time to think about it. And to think about us, too."
"I can understand that," I said. "And I don't mind. It's been a terrible time for you and Gillian. What is she going to do?"
"We're both going to America soon, and the doctors there will try to repair the damage to her face. The house is going to be sold while we're away."
She fell silent, and afraid that she would ask more questions about her father, I changed the subject again.
"What were you doing in Scotland?" I asked.
Oh, I was asked to advise on the building of a new laboratory. I think it needs to be P4, and they only want to go to P3.
I don't understand, I said. What are P3 and P4?
Oh, I forgot. I'm so used to talking about my work with Daddy, I'd forgotten you don't know much about genetics. Daddy always seemed to understand what I was talking about so easily. Are you sure you want me to explain?
She looked at me doubtfully.
It's a bit technical.
Yes, please, I replied. I'm not a complete idiot, but don't make it too complicated.
Well, in 1975, scientists studying genetics were very worried by the possible dangers of the experiments that were being done. There were no government laws to follow, but everyone felt that something had to be done. So the scientists agreed among themselves about safety and the kind of experiments that should be permitted. For the first time, scientists became their own police and did not wait for governments to make laws for them. Genetic laboratories go from P1 to P4. P1 is the ordinary, basic genetics laboratory. P4 is for highly dangerous experiments, where everything has to be totally safe in all possible conditions. Airlocks, showers, changes of clothing, that sort of thing.
And your problem in Scotland is all about safety?
Well, they've got a P2 laboratory, and the work they do is changing. I believe they need to make it to a P4 laboratory. But that's very, very expensive, and they only want to go to P3.
Why is that? I said.
Well, they want to work with bacteria called E. coli, which are harmless. Everyone has millions of them in his body. It's not dangerous to study them, but nobody knows what could happen if someone does an important experiment and transfers the wrong gene. Everything is so new in this branch of science. There are no laws, at least no man-made laws, to decide what should be done and what should not be done.
But you're the expert. If you think it's dangerous, surely people will listen to you, I said, puzzled.
Not necessarily. In the end, it's the politicians who tell you how much money you can spend, how safe you can make an important laboratory. But their reasons are not usually scientific.
Everything always seems to come back to money and politicians, I thought to myself.
Are they really the best people to decide? Chapter 12. The Secret Computer. Somewhere, the key to Ashton's death lay in Benson's life, and I decided to investigate everything about Howard Benson. Ogilvy had told me that there was no information in the computer about Benson, but I remembered putting all the Ashton names, and Benson's, through the computer right at the beginning. Benson's records had been there then, but locked away in level purple. What had happened to them? Had somebody taken Benson's records out of the computer? It was a puzzle I couldn't solve, so I went to the War Office to see if I could look at Benson's army records from 30 years before. All I knew was that Benson had been a soldier during the war, but I had no idea when he had left the army. It took several hours of searching through long lists of names and numbers before I discovered, to my total amazement, that Ashton and Benson had left the British Army on exactly the same day, the 4th of January, 1947. I knew from the computer that George Ashton was not a real British soldier, but a Russian scientist in disguise. The coincidence was too great. So if it wasn't a coincidence, it must have been planned. But who had planned it? Was Benson another Russian? What reason could there be to explain why he had left the army on the same day as George Ashton, and then worked for and lived with Ashton for more than 30 years? I took Benson's army file home and read it very carefully. Everything seemed normal, exactly as Ogilvy had found when he had investigated Benson. Then I suddenly noticed one strange point. When Benson's departure from the army was first mentioned, an officer had written, "Proposed leaving date, 21st of March, 1947. But Benson had actually left on the 4th of January, 1947. Was the difference important? The health of every soldier is carefully watched and recorded, and I looked at Benson's medical record in the army. Early in November 1946, he had complained that he had pains in his left arm. In December, the doctor had asked for a special examination of Benson's heart. And 3 weeks later, in January 1947, Benson had left the army. I telephoned a friend of mine who was a doctor. If a man in his early 30s complains of a pain in his left arm for 3 months, what could be wrong with him? I asked. "Oh, that depends," he replied. "It could be one of several things. If it's a friend of yours, tell him to go to a doctor at once." "Why? Is it so serious?" "It could be a kind of heart disease," he replied. "Is that bad?" I asked. "Would the man survive?" "Oh, that depends again," said the doctor. "Is he fit? Does he smoke?" I remembered that Benson had had a desk job in the army. "Let's suppose that he's not fit, and that he smokes. Then he could drop dead at any time, if he doesn't get the right treatment immediately. Malcolm, is this someone I know?" "No," I replied. "There was a man in that condition in 1946. He died a few weeks ago, 30 years later. What do you think of that?" "I'm very surprised. Most people with that condition would have died long ago." The next person I spoke to was Benson's last doctor in Marlow. He was not keen to tell me about Benson's health, but I asked him when Benson had last had a heart attack. He laughed and said, "I can certainly tell you that. There was absolutely nothing wrong with Benson's heart. It was in excellent condition." I thanked him and rang off. It was now fairly clear to me what had happened. The real Benson had suffered from a bad heart, and had died after the 18th of December 1946, and before the 4th of January 1947. Somehow, a new healthy Benson had taken his place, had left the army on the 4th of January, and had then remained very close to George Ashton until the day, 30 years later, when he had killed him. I had learned something,
but I did still not know why Benson had killed George Ashton. It was time for Penny and Gillian to leave for America. They had decided to sell the house at Marlow, and the auction was going to be held while they were away. Gillian expected to be in America for quite a long time, but Penny hoped to be back after a week or two. She was then supposed to go back to visit the laboratory in Scotland. It was about this time that I began to feel that somebody had given me quite a lot of valuable information, but I had failed to recognize its full importance. What was it? I thought about it for hours, but the right piece of information refused to come to the surface of my mind. Something I had heard, or maybe something I had read, was the key to the problem. But I could not find out what it was, no matter how much I tried. On the day of the auction, I went to the Ashtons' house near Marlow. To my surprise, Michaelis was there, looking as unhappy as I felt. "I'm glad Gillian isn't here to see this," he remarked as we looked around the rooms full of articles for sale. "It's all so sad to see everything being sold off like this. But the model railway interests me. I thought I'd like to buy a bit of it, but I don't think I'll have a chance. Lucas Hartman is here." "Who's he?" I asked. "A rich American who collects model railways. He'll buy the whole thing, I expect. It'll probably cost him £15,000, maybe more, but he'll buy it." "So much? Over £15,000 for a model railway? I don't believe it," I said. "Wait and see," replied Michaelis. "And what annoys me is that I never got to understand the system. Ashton's timetables didn't fit. You remember I showed you his big book of railway timetables, the old London, Midland and Scottish Railway?" "Yes, I remember. You were going to compare them with the original ones. Weren't they the same?" "No, they're completely different. The pattern of Ashton's timetables doesn't seem to be like any normal system of railway timetabling. I just couldn't understand it." As Michaelis was talking, I had a picture in my mind of George Ashton as he lay dying in the snow, trying to give me a Swedish railway timetable. It was as if a bomb exploded in my head. "By God, that's it," I whispered. "That's got to be it." Michaelis stared at me. "What's wrong?" "Come on," I said. "We've got to speak to the auctioneer." 5 minutes later, we were talking to the man in charge of the auction. "I'm speaking for the Ashton sisters, Penelope and Gillian. You mustn't sell the model railway upstairs." "I'm not sure I can do that," said the auctioneer. "You say you speak for the Ashton sisters. Can you prove it?" "No, I can't, at the moment." "I'm sorry, Mr. Jaggard," he said. "I was engaged by Miss Penelope Ashton to sell the contents of this house. I can't stop that without a letter from her." "But she's in the United States," I almost shouted. "Then there's nothing to be done," he said. "The sale must go ahead." I tried ringing Ogilvy, Penny's lawyer, even Penny herself in America, but I could find none of them. Finally, I rang my bank manager. "What can I do for you, Mr. Jaggard?" he asked. "Later this afternoon, I'm going to write a fairly large cheque, more than I have in my bank account at the moment. I want to borrow enough money to cover a cheque for £20,000 or even £25,000 for a month. Can I do that?" "Yes, I don't see any difficulty, Mr. Jaggard. We'll cover your cheque. I hope you know what you're doing. In any case, come and see me tomorrow about it. I'll need your signature on some papers." I put the phone down. Michaelis was looking at me as if he thought I had suddenly gone mad. "Listen," I said. "I think we found Ashton's secret hiding place. I think that model railway is a computer, a sort of mechanical computer. You couldn't understand Ashton's railway timetables. You said they didn't fit the original ones. Well, I don't think they're timetables at all. They're computer programs, and that's where Ashton had been hiding all his original thinking. That's what he was trying to tell me when he gave me that Swedish railway timetable, just before he died.
Michaelis shook his head. "It's a crazy idea," he said slowly. "But I suppose you might be right."
"I hope to God I am right," I said. "I'm taking a big risk. A very expensive risk." We went back to the room where everything was being sold. The auctioneer was just starting to sell the railway. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a unique model railway with the most modern control equipment. It is one of the finest examples of model railways that we have ever seen. How much will you offer me for it?" The offers started at £8,000 and went up slowly to £15,000. Hartman had said nothing, but suddenly he offered £16,000. I held up a finger, and the auctioneer said, "I have £17,000. Will anyone offer me more than £17,000? Hartman raised his finger to offer £18,000. The only two people crazy enough to spend so much money for a model railway were Hartman and myself. The price went up and up. Finally, I won. Hartman stopped, and the auctioneer called out, "Sold to Mr. Jaggard for £31,000. Just as I was talking to the auctioneer, Michaelis called me to the telephone. It was Ogilvy. I told him what I had done. I told him that the department now owed me £31,000 for a model railway. I do not wish to write down the words that he used to describe me. Chapter 13. Ashton's Work and Benson's Secret. From America, Penny wrote to say that the operations on Gillian's face were going well. She said that Gillian wanted me to pass this news on to Peter Michaelis, as she could not write herself. In her next letter, Penny asked me to meet her at Heathrow Airport, and that made me feel a lot better. If she had decided not to marry me, she would not have asked me to meet her. When I met her, she was very tired, but I took her to her new flat in London, and we sat talking for a while. She told me about her visits to several American universities. "They're doing very good work with PV40, she said. "What's PV40? I asked. "Something to do with genetics?" "Oh, it's a virus, but it's harmless to human beings," she laughed. "I keep forgetting that you don't know anything about genetics." Suddenly, the little worrying thought at the back of my mind expressed itself. "When your father was alive, did you talk to him a lot about your work?" I asked. "Oh, yes," Penny replied, "all the time. He knew quite a lot about it, and he understood things very quickly. He even made some suggestions which surprised Professor Lumsden." "Why was that?" "Well, Daddy never did any experiments in genetics. He learned things from talking with me. But some of the ideas he had were very clever. They were unusual, but they worked when Lumsden and I tried them out in the laboratory." I felt like a man who has just found a key after looking for it for many weeks. The next day, I went to see Ogilvy. He had been very suspicious of my ideas about the model railway, but he had agreed to investigate it. The railway had been moved to a secret place, and the computer experts had begun work on it. At first, they thought it was a great joke, of course, but after a while, they realized that it was definitely a computer, and that the timetables were detailed programs. Unfortunately, they had not been able to understand the programs yet, but at least I was not £31,000 the poorer. I told Ogilvy about my latest idea. "I think we can guess what Ashton's computer programs are all about. The date of the first one is about the time Penny started her research in genetics. I believe Ashton taught himself genetics because that was what his daughter was studying. He used her books and her notes and didn't need to buy anything which would tell outsiders what he was studying. She could keep him up to date with the latest developments without anyone ever suspecting that he was busy learning the subject, probably even better than Penny herself knew it, and all without ever going near a laboratory. "If you're right," said Ogilvy, "what do we do about it?"
"Talk to Penny, of course," I said. "Tell her what we think. See if she agrees. Let her tell us what she knows."
"No, that's too risky," he said. "We'd have to tell her too much about her father and why he wanted to hide what he was doing."
"But you can't keep this secret from her. Not if you want to understand it. She's a part of it now. He learned everything from her," I said angrily.
"Calm down, Malcolm. I didn't say anything about secrets. I just said we'd have to be very careful about what we say. You can leave that side of things to me, so don't worry about it."
After that meeting, I had a strange suspicion that Ogilvy was not being completely honest with me. It was the first time I had ever felt that about him, and I didn't like it. I went to see Penny that afternoon at University College. As I passed Professor Lumsden's office, Lord Krieger came out. He looked very surprised and demanded,
"What are you doing here?"
I didn't think it had anything to do with him, and replied, "Just visiting." He stopped and said,
"You know the Ashton case is closed?"
"Yes, of course," I replied.
"Then you know you shouldn't be coming here to ask questions."
"I'm sorry, Lord Krieger, but I don't think I have to ask your permission when I want to visit the girl I'm going to marry."
"Oh," he said, "I'd forgotten."
His eyes changed and lost their suspicion.
"I'm sorry about that. I'd forgotten that you're engaged to Dr. Ashton. I wish you both every happiness, but now I must go. I'm in a bit of a hurry."
As he hurried off along the corridor, I wondered why his first thought on seeing me was to think it had something to do with the Ashton case. That evening, Penny invited me to dinner in her new flat. After dinner, as we were sitting having coffee, she said quietly, "When would you like us to get married, Malcolm?" That night, the coffee got spilt on the carpet, and I stayed for breakfast. The next day, Penny had to go to Scotland because she was still involved in arguments about the safety of the laboratory there. For me, the rest of the week went by very slowly. I bought some tickets for the theatre for the day when Penny was due to return, and I went on with my work. I had learned nothing new about Benson, and the computer experts were not making much progress towards understanding Ashton's programs. Ogilvy seemed to be avoiding me, but I did learn from him that Lord Krieger was now trying to persuade the minister to transfer the work on the computer programs from Ogilvy's department to Krieger's. That worried me a lot. Krieger's special interest was in biological and chemical weapons. If Ashton's programs were really about genetics, as I thought they were, they could be very useful to Krieger, and he would make sure they were kept very secret. Perhaps that was why Ashton had hidden them so well, to keep them from dangerous people like Krieger, who would use them only to increase their own power. Penny was expected back on Tuesday, and I went round to her flat. I waited, but she did not return. Early the next morning, I rang Professor Lumsden, who said he had not heard from her for several days. When I asked for her telephone number in Scotland, he said he was not allowed to give it to me. I was rather puzzled. There seemed to be another mystery here, and I began to get worried about Penny. When I got home, I found that the suitcase which I had left behind in Sweden had finally been sent back to me by the Swedish police. That gave me an idea, and I drove out to the Ashtons' house at Marlow. The cases which Ashton and Benson had taken to Sweden had also been sent back. I looked at everything very carefully, took everything out of the cases, and examined it thoroughly, but found nothing. As I was putting Benson's clothes back into the case, his wallet fell on the floor. I had already examined it once, but this time, when I picked it up, I noticed that the silk lining was torn. I examined it more closely,
The lining had been very carefully cut, and hidden inside was a piece of paper. I pulled it out. It was a letter. To whom it may concern, this letter is carried by Howard Greatrix Benson. If anyone has any doubts or questions about his honesty, his actions, or his motives, please contact me immediately. The date on the letter was the 4th of January 1947, the day Ashton and Benson had left the army. The letter was signed by James Poulton, who was now Lord Krieger. I was getting more and more suspicious about Krieger. Why did his name keep coming up in the Ashton case? I could now see that there was a strong connection between him and Ashton's probable work on genetics, and now Lumsden and Penny. What exactly was going on in Scotland? I went to see Lumsden and asked him to ring Penny in Scotland. When he refused, I got angry. He would not tell me where the laboratory was, or what work was being done there, or even who ran it. I was now very suspicious, and finally got Lumsden to admit that Krieger was the man in charge. Krieger was in a hurry to get results. Penny had insisted on a P4 laboratory, which was much more expensive and would take much more time to construct. But that was because she was worried about safety, I said. Yes, but Krieger thought she was being too careful. He was pushing Carter hard to get results fast, replied Lumsden. Who's Carter? I wanted to know. The chief scientific officer. There's something wrong at that laboratory. I'm sure of it, I said. Please telephone Penny, but I don't think they let you speak to her. He hesitated for a long time, but then made the call. As he dialed, I watched his finger and carefully remembered the number. This is Professor Lumsden. I'd like to speak to Dr. Ashton. Yes, I'll wait while you get her. He put his hand over the telephone and said, They've gone to get her. They think she's in her room. I don't think they'll find her, I said. Suddenly Lumsden spoke again to the telephone. Yes? On the mainland. I see. Will you ask her to telephone me as soon as she comes back? He put the phone down slowly. They say she's gone to the mainland. So the laboratory's on an island? Yes, he said. They could be right, you know. They might be telling the truth. But I could tell from his voice that he did not really believe his own words. I don't think so, I replied. Something has happened to her, and I'm going to find out what it is. Feeling very worried, I left Lumsden and went to see Ogilvy. I marched straight into his office. He was not pleased. I didn't send for you, he said coldly. I paid no attention. I've discovered Benson's secret, I said. He was Krieger's man. Ogilvy's eyes opened wide. I don't believe it. I put the letter on his desk. Read that. You will see how Benson was Krieger's spy on Ashton for 30 years. Even when Krieger was no longer responsible for Ashton, he still had his spy watching. That's why Benson's records disappeared from the computer. It all fits together, admitted Ogilvy. But I still can't believe it. There must be another explanation. Well, I'll get it out of Krieger, even if I have to beat it out of him. Penny Ashton has disappeared, and Krieger has something to do with it. What on earth are you talking about? He demanded. I told him about Penny's work in Scotland, and how Krieger was involved in this secret laboratory. I gave him the phone number and said, See if you can find out where that telephone is. 5 minutes later, he had the answer in 2 words. Cladach Dulach. Chapter 14. Trouble in Scotland. Cladach Dulach was a hard place to get to. It was one of the summer islands off the northwest coast of Scotland, islands which are beautiful in summer and terrible in winter. I flew to Inverness and hired a car to drive across Scotland to Ullapool,
the nearest fishing village to Clydach. It was late when I arrived, but I found a small hotel quite easily. I managed to find a fisherman who promised to take me to Clydach the next morning, if the weather was right. Before dinner, I sat in the bar talking with the local people. They did not know much about what happened on Clydach. There were a few buildings, that was all, but the people who worked there always came and went by helicopter. They never came to Ullapool. Nobody else was allowed to land on the island. "What do you think they're doing there?" I asked. "Do you think it's another Grignard?" Grignard was a Scottish island, where a government experiment in biological weapons had gone very wrong many years ago. The island had been badly poisoned, and was still too dangerous for anyone to go there. "It had better not be," said a man called Archie Ferguson angrily. He was a tall, powerful Scot with a soft voice and a fierce-looking face. "If we thought it was another Grignard," he went on, "we'd take the fire to it and burn everything to the ground." After dinner, I made a telephone call to Clydach. A voice said, "How can I help you?" "I'd like to speak to Dr. Ashton. My name is Malcolm Jaggard." "Just a moment. I'll see if she's available," came the reply. There was a 4-minute silence. Then another voice said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Jaggard, but Dr. Ashton went to the mainland and hasn't come back yet." "Whereabouts on the mainland?" I asked. There was a pause. "Where are you speaking from, Mr. Jaggard?" "From London. Why?" The voice did not answer the question. "She went to Ullapool. That's our nearest town. She wanted to do some shopping. May I ask how you got our number?" "Dr. Ashton gave it to me," I lied. "When do you expect her back?" "Oh, I don't know. The weather has changed, and I don't think she'll be able to get a boat back to the island until tomorrow morning. I'm sure she'll be back then." "I see. May I ask who I'm speaking to?" "I'm Dr. Carter." "Thank you, Dr. Carter. I'll ring tomorrow." As I put the phone down, I knew that I was not the only person who was telling lies. I went back to the bar and spoke to Archie Ferguson again. "I've been talking to the people on Clydach. They told me a woman came to Ullapool today from the island. She's about 1.70 meters tall, dark hair, about 28 years old." Robbie Ferguson, Archie's brother, interrupted me. "How did she come from the island?" "By boat," I answered. "Then she didn't come," he said positively. "There's no boat on Clydach, only a helicopter. Nobody came from the island to Ullapool today, I can promise you that." The next morning, Robbie Ferguson's boat took me across the rough seas to Clydach. It was a low island, which looked as if the sea could cover it at any time. Before I left, I said to Archie, "Look, if I'm not back by 4 o'clock this afternoon, I want you to get the police and come looking for me." "And if they won't let us land on the island, what do we do then?" he wanted to know. I took a card from my pocket and gave it to him. "If I don't come back, ring that number and ask for a man called Ogilvy. Tell him everything you know." "I'll do that, and maybe we'll come with fire to make Clydach clean again. Fire is a great thing for destroying what is bad." I did not argue with him, but as Robbie and I approached Clydach, I felt better knowing that I had Archie Ferguson behind me in case anything went wrong. He was a dependable man. It was a rough voyage across the sea to Clydach. Although it was not a high island, the sharp rocks made it a difficult place to land. I could not think of any reason why anyone should want to build a biological laboratory there, unless they had something which they very much wanted to hide. Robbie Ferguson brought the boat in as close as he could,
and I jumped onto the rocky shore. I saw a notice, "Government property, landing forbidden." It did not say who had forbidden everyone to land on the island. There were some steps leading from the rocks where I had landed. When I got to the top, a man came running up. "Stop! Can't you read?" he shouted. "Yes, I can read, but the boat's gone." "Well, you can't stay here. What do you want?" "I want to talk to Dr. Carter," I replied. "What about?" "If Dr. Carter wants you to know what we talk about, I'm sure he'll tell you later," I said sharply. "Who are you?" the man said angrily. "Same answer," I replied. "Just take me to Carter." Very unhappily, he took me along the path to the buildings of the laboratory, and I took a look around. Clanach was a small island where only the seabirds seemed to be at home. There were 3 low buildings, all connected. I was taken into an office where an older man was sitting, working at a desk. He looked up as we entered. "Who's this, Max?" "I found this man coming ashore. He says he wants to see you." He turned to me. "Who are you? What do you want?" I sat down. "I'm Malcolm Jaggard. I've come to see Dr. Ashton." "Didn't you ring me last night? I told you she wasn't here. She's on the mainland, in Ullapool." "No, she isn't. I've just come from there. And she wasn't there last night either," I said firmly. "Well, she isn't here now," he said, "and I must ask you to leave. This place isn't open to the public." "If Dr. Ashton isn't here, where is she? How did she get to Ullapool?" "By boat, of course." "But you haven't got a boat here, Dr. Carter. All journeys are by helicopter." "You're taking too much of an interest in us, Mr. Jaggard. That could be dangerous." "Just let Dr. Ashton come and talk to me," I replied. "If she's missing, I promise that I'll make a lot of trouble for you." A voice came from behind me. "Dr. Carter can't bring Dr. Ashton to see you." I turned and saw Lord Krieger in the doorway. "Dr. Carter, leave me to talk to Mr. Jaggard alone," he went on. He turned to the man I had met outside and who had brought me in. "Search him, Max. Make sure he hasn't got a gun." "No gun," said Max after he had searched me carefully. "Oh, well, even if he hasn't got a gun, he could still get drowned if he was on the island trying to break into these buildings, couldn't he?" said Krieger calmly. "No problem, sir," said Max unfeelingly. "The waves sometimes break right over the island." "You'd better be careful, Lord Krieger," I said. "We found the connection between you and Benson." Krieger looked surprised. "How could I have a connection with Benson? What possible evidence could there be?" "A letter carried by Benson, dated January 1947, and signed by you." "A letter?" said Krieger, and he looked through me into the past. His eyes changed as he began to remember. "You mean Benson still carried that letter with him? After 30 years? I don't believe it. Where is it now?" "Ogilvy has it. He's probably shown it to the minister by now." Krieger was angry. "I'm not going to let you beat me, Jaggard. Max, put this man somewhere safe while I think. I've found my way out of bigger problems than this. It's a question of studying the weaknesses of each man, you and Ogilvy." "What about Penny Ashton?" I said angrily. "What's happened to her?" "You'll see her in good time," said Krieger coldly, "if I allow you to." In my anger, I wanted to attack him violently, but Max had a gun in his hand, so I could do nothing. I was taken along a corridor and into a small, dark room. The door closed heavily behind me, and I was left alone in the dark to think about my problems. I realized that it had been a good idea to tell Krieger about the letter. That had saved me.
Before I had mentioned the letter, Krieger was thinking of having me thrown into the sea, but the knowledge that Ogilvy had the letter had stopped that plan. But I now had a very clear idea of just how dangerous Krieger could be. I was in that black room for many hours, but finally the door opened. Max was there with his gun, and safely behind him stood Krieger, looking relaxed. "Come with me," he said, and I followed him along the corridor with Max walking behind me, his gun in his hand. "I've found a way of dealing with Ogilvy. There'll be no problem there," said Krieger casually. "But that still leaves you. After you've seen Dr. Ashton, we'll have a talk." He stopped at a door. "In here?" he said. I went into a room with a large window, which looked into another room. There was a bed in that room, and a woman was lying in the bed, unconscious, with plastic tubes leading from her to various machines. I could hardly recognize my Penny. "In God's name, what happened?" I shouted at Krieger. "Oh, there was an accident last week. I'm afraid Dr. Ashton is rather ill." "What's wrong with her?" I shouted again. "We don't know. It's something new, and Carter can't identify it." I was very angry and very frightened for Penny. "It's your fault, isn't it? She wanted you to have a P4 laboratory and you were too mean. This place isn't safe. Why isn't she being properly looked after? She should be in a hospital, one of the best hospitals." "You're probably right," said Krieger calmly. "But that would create risks for me. Not health risks, but risks of security. This is a top-secret laboratory." "But you can't leave her to die here. She needs to have the very best of medical treatment," I shouted at Krieger. "You're in no position to make demands of me," said Krieger, and walked out. I followed him along the corridor to Carter's laboratory. We went inside, through an airlock between two doors. There were glass cases all round the walls, containing small dishes with Carter's experimental bacteria. Each dish was in its own protective glass box. Krieger turned to me. "Look, you can see we do take care here. What happened to Dr. Ashton was an accident, a 1,000,000 to 1 chance. It's very important to me that you believe me." "If you'd listened to her, it wouldn't have happened," I said. "But I believe you. I don't think it was done on purpose. What's so important about what I think, anyway?" "Well, I can come to an agreement with Ogilvy, but I still have to make sure you don't give away my secrets." "Have you spoken with Ogilvy?" I asked. "Yes, of course. He understands." I felt sick with disgust. Even Ogilvy seemed to be willing to hide the truth, to allow himself to be bribed by this dangerous government official. I knew then that I would never work with Ogilvy again. "The trouble is that you have to be around Jaggard for some time to come. If anything happened to you, Ogilvy might change his mind. That's too great a risk, and it creates a problem for me." "How to keep my mouth shut without actually killing me?" "Exactly. You are a man like myself. We go straight to the heart of any problem. But I think we can do business. I'll exchange the life of Dr. Ashton for your silence." I looked at Krieger with total disgust. He had said that the solution to his problem would be found by studying men's weaknesses, and he had found mine. "As soon as you agree, Dr. Ashton can be taken to hospital. There's a document I want you to sign. It'll make sure that you remain silent." A telephone rang. Krieger told Max to give him the gun and then answer the call. There was silence as Max listened, saying only, "Who? Where? How many?" He put the phone down. "There's trouble outside. A lot of men are landing on the island." "Who are they?" said Krieger. "Local people." "Stupid Scots fishermen. Go and chase them away, Max." As Max left, Krieger turned to me and asked,
Is this anything to do with you?" "How could I start a local war?" I asked. "But I want Penny in hospital fast. How do we get off here?" "A phone call will bring a helicopter in 2 hours. "You'd better make that phone call then," I replied. While he was thinking about what I had just said, I hit him hard in the stomach. As he fell to the floor, his gun went off. The bullet missed me, but I heard the crash of breaking glass. By the time he picked himself up, I was holding the gun. "What's the number to ring for the helicopter?" I said. "You can't win, Jaggard," shouted Krieger. "Nobody will ever believe your word rather than mine." He turned his head, noticed the broken glass, and screamed, "Oh, God! Look what you've done! I'm getting out of here." 2 of the glass cases in the laboratory were broken, and the contents of the dishes had spilled on the floor. Krieger tried to push past me to get out of the room. He did not seem to care about the gun, so I hit him over the head, and he fell to the floor, unconscious. I turned quickly as the door of the laboratory burst open and Archie Ferguson appeared. "Get out!" I shouted. "Get out! It's not safe! Go next door and I'll talk to you." The door shut very quickly, and a moment later I saw Archie through the glass window of Carter's laboratory. Krieger still lay unconscious at my feet. Chapter 15. Biological Disaster. There was a microphone on one of the tables in Carter's laboratory. I picked it up with a shaking hand and spoke. "Can you hear me, Archie?" He nodded and picked up another microphone. "What's happened here, Malcolm?" he asked. "This place is bloody dangerous, Archie. Don't go into any of the laboratories. Go and tell your men that now." Archie dropped the microphone and ran off quickly to tell his men. After a few minutes, he came back, and I told him to arrest everybody on the island. I showed him my official identity card and said, "That gives you the power to arrest people. The government will support that. You're working under my instructions." "What do we do now?" he wanted to know. "Ring Ogilvy and let me speak to him. I daren't come out of this laboratory. I don't know what experiments they're doing here, but the bacteria we've accidentally released are almost certainly very dangerous." When I turned around, Krieger was starting to wake up, but he said nothing. The call to Ogilvy came through. Before he could start asking questions, I said sharply, "This is an emergency. Krieger's laboratory has gone wrong. There's 1 serious case of infection and 2 suspected cases. The bacteria causing it are new to medicine, probably man-made, and highly infectious. We need immediate hospital treatment for 3 people in P4 conditions. I suggest the biological centre at Porton Down." "I'll get that arranged at once," said Ogilvy. "Who are the 3 people in danger?" "The serious case is Penelope Ashton." There was a gasp at the other end of the line. "Oh, my God!" "I'm sorry, Malcolm," came Ogilvy's voice. I went on. "The suspected cases are Krieger and myself." "For God's sake, Malcolm, what's been happening up there?" "You'd better ask Dr. Carter. He's the man in charge of the experiments up here. But make it quick. I think Penny is dying." When I'd finished talking to Ogilvy, Archie Ferguson picked up his microphone. He had been listening to the conversation and was very angry. He wanted to throw Krieger and the others into the sea, but I persuaded him that that was too dangerous for the fish. I asked him to find me a cassette recorder and food for Krieger and me. He was unhappy at the thought of getting food for Krieger, but did it, and pushed it into the laboratory. I got the cassette recorder ready. Krieger did not seem interested. It was as if he had given up. "Nothing matters any more," he said. "How did Benson learn about Ashton's work?" I asked. "Oh, that was a long time ago. 5 years ago, at least. He saw that Ashton was helping his daughter with her studies, but also starting to do a lot of work on his own. We never knew what it was. He hid it from Benson, and we thought it was hidden in his secret room." He stopped and looked up at me. "You're a clever man. I never thought of the railway. I should have done. Ashton wasn't the sort of man to play with toy trains." Now that he had started to tell the truth, Cregar's voice flowed on. I suppose he thought there was no reason to keep silent. It was a sort of deathbed confession. I asked him about Maybury's attack on Gillian. "I had nothing to do with that," said Cregar. "It was senseless. I didn't even know Maybury existed until the police found him. But I was ready to take advantage of it. I had the flat in Stockholm ready and the false passport. It only needed Benson to persuade Ashton that his girls were in danger and that my department had a safe house for him in Sweden. He ran away. All I wanted to do was look in his secret room. But it was empty." I began to see why so many misunderstandings had happened. Ashton had never known the truth, and neither had I. But why on earth did Benson kill Ashton? "Orders from 30 years ago, to make sure Ashton didn't go back to the Russians. I never thought to cancel the order, and Benson remembered it after all those years. I can hardly believe it." Cregar seemed almost proud of Benson's loyalty, even though it had led to Ashton's unnecessary death. Out of curiosity, I asked, "Cregar, why did you do all this?" He looked at me in surprise. "A man must do something important in his life. Something that people will remember." I stared at him, and felt cold to my bones. He carried on talking about power and politics, but I was no longer interested. Finally, Ogilvy rang to say there was a helicopter with a specialist medical team on its way to us. The men who came were dressed in plastic clothing from head to foot, just like men from space. They put us in plastic envelopes and carried us away to hospital. I never saw Cregar again. Chapter 16. My New Job. A month later, I came out of the special hospital where a team of 30 doctors and nurses had looked after me. Penny had even more doctors than I had because her condition was worse than mine, but Ogilvy and Lumsden had brought the best doctors from the United States and Europe, and they had succeeded in saving Penny's life. Dr. Starkey was the man in charge. If Dr. Ashton had been on Cladach for one more day without proper medical attention, she would be dead now, he said. You are both very lucky. Slowly, Penny began to get better. I couldn't kiss her or even touch her in a protective glass cage, but we began to talk about getting married. She said she thought a double wedding would be nice. Michaelis had asked Gillian to marry him. I was not too surprised at that piece of news. Ogilvy had come to visit me in hospital. "I've listened to the cassette of your conversation with Cregar," he said. "I don't think even Cregar can escape from this problem." "Have the computer experts had any success with Ashton's computer programs?" I asked. "Yes, and my God, they're fantastic. Everyone said the man was a genius, and he's proved it." "How is that? What's he done?" "Well, I don't really understand it," said Ogilvy. "But it seems that Ashton has done for genetics what Einstein did for physics. He studied genetics from a mathematical point of view, and has shown that genetics has a mathematical basis. He's been able to show what genetic arrangements are possible or not possible, without depending on laboratory experiments for each arrangement. It's quite fantastic." "That should make Professor Lumsden happy," I said. "He doesn't know," said Ogilvy. "The information is still secret." "Why?" "The minister thinks that there are good reasons for keeping it secret, at least for a while. We have to study how useful the information could be." I felt disgusted. The minister was another Cregar. He had found a piece of important information, and that gave him power, as long as it was secret. He was going to hold on to it. I began to realize why Ashton had hidden his ideas. It was to keep them away from men like Cregar and the minister. Ogilvy went on, When you've fully recovered and get back to work, I've got a new job for you. I want to prepare you for Kerr's job. He's going to retire in 2 years, and you're the right man for the job. Kerr was number 2 to Ogilvy in the department. When I retire in 7 years' time, Ogilvy continued, you could be head of the department. Get lost, I said bluntly. I don't want the job. Ogilvy was shocked. What did you say? What's got into you, Malcolm? You weren't interested in what was right or wrong. You were going to do a deal with Krieger. He told me he had come to an agreement with you. I was shocked. Krieger called me an honest man. But to Krieger that isn't a good thing. It just meant he didn't know how to buy me. He could buy everyone else so that they would do what he said, even you. That's why I don't want your job. I might become like you. How could an honest man do what we did to George Ashton? Malcolm, I don't think you're being sensible about this, he replied angrily. I'm a human being. I try to be honest, and I want to stay that way. Your job would destroy that part of me. Ogilvy went away, very unhappy. Chapter 17. The Future. And we all lived happily ever after. At least, that's what would have happened in the old-fashioned kind of story we all used to read when we were children. But my story is different. Penny came out of hospital fully recovered. Gillian came back from New York, looking better than she had before the acid attack. Together with Michaelis, we all went out for dinner and planned a wonderful double wedding. 10 days before the wedding, I went back to see Dr. Starkey. He asked me a lot of questions, gave me a lot of medical tests, and told me to come back in a week. On the day I went back to see him, I read in the Times that Lord Krieger had died. I was disgusted by what was written about him. A loyal public servant who worked for his country for many years with no thought for himself. That was not the Krieger who had been quite prepared to let Penny and me die on Cladach in order to save himself. Dr. Starkey was very serious when I saw him. "It's bad news, isn't it?" I said. "Yes, it is," he said directly. "It's cancer." It was the news I had expected. "How long have I got?" 6 months, maybe a year. It could be longer, but not much." "Is this the same thing that killed Krieger?" I asked. "Yes," he sighed. "Krieger wanted fast results, and Carter didn't wait for the best quality materials to come from the States. He used some experimental bacteria which were difficult to control biologically, and he didn't have the right kind of laboratory. Penny Ashton was right there. The new bacteria that escaped when you and Krieger were in the laboratory weren't safe." I suddenly felt frightened. "What about Penny?" "She's all right. Her illness was caused by completely different bacteria." I felt relieved. "Thank you, Dr. Starkey. You've been very honest with me, and I appreciate it." I went back to London and told Penny the bad news. She understood immediately what had happened. It was her job, after all. She still wanted to get married, but I said no. I knew what I wanted to do. "There's a place in the south of Ireland," I said to Penny. "The mountains are green. The sea is blue when the sun shines, and it's green when the sun doesn't shine. It's by the sea, where the Atlantic waves come in from the west. Come, live with me, and be my love. I could do with 6 months of life there, if you're with me." We went to Ireland immediately after Gillian and Peter were married, and we wished them every happiness. We have lived here for 9 months. My condition has got gradually worse, and at one time I thought of killing myself. But I knew I had one final job to do, to write the story of the Ashton case. Penny has loved me
and taken care of me. She's brought a doctor and 3 nurses to help her, but now my time is getting short. I have told the story honestly. God knows I am not proud of my own part in it. Penny has read the story. Some parts have upset her terribly. Some parts have made her laugh. Other parts have made her sad. She has typed it all herself. I want people to be able to read my story, to know what is done by governments in the name of the people. There are too many Kraegars around in government. Ashton's new work on genetics is still a secret, to be used for whatever purposes some government minister thinks will do him some good. Because of that, Penny and I are determined that her father's story and the news of his discoveries in genetics should not be hidden. We have done what we can to make sure that the story will be published in full. This story, and my life, are now coming to an end. It is not a happy story. In the words of an American writer, we have met the enemy, and he is us. I hope, for your sake, that he is wrong.